Well, thanks everyone for coming to the second session. I'm excited about last week's kickoff and then to roll into the substantive content starting this week. So for the Innovator to Entrepreneur program, ITEP, this week we're focusing on starting a business. Some feedback we heard in prior years was that we often jumped straight into how to get customers or how to fill out the application. A lot of folks were curious of, do I need a business to apply for the small business type of grant? And so we'll be covering that type of content today. Last week reviewed ITEP overall, the cohort-based model, how the various constituent elements of the cohort and Slack and mentors and presentation work. If you need a reminder on any of those items, particularly the Q&A at the end is a nice place to get refreshed, or most of us are available on Slack and pretty responsive there. But this week we'll be sort of breaking down the how to start a business into a few different parts. So first part that we'll be going over is just literally how do you launch the company? What are startup operations? It's not going to be a complete MBA crash course in every part that you need to know for figuring out the business, but it will sort of get you that head start. And then for the second part, we'll be focusing on defining the business. So outside of the like logistical, legal, operational components, how do you actually get the business up and running? And then finally, talking about University Spinouts as the third component there. And so to sort of frame the things that you will walk away with overall in the session. So first part, as mentioned, is the business fundamentals, incorporation, et cetera. And during every session, we'll be relating back to how does that relate to SBIR and STTR. And for today's session, there's gonna, for at least the sessions I'm leading, an application of some sort. And so today we'll be reviewing the presentation deck. Let me pull up chat. Perfect. I'll be reviewing chat, and we have other folks, mentors and instructors checking things out. So hopefully there's nothing we miss between all of that. With all that high level work completed, I'll probably walk through each section and have stopping points. But for today's session in particular, every business is a little bit different. So I would highly encourage folks to ask questions in chat or come off mute and talk about your specific case for how that applies. But to start, so first and foremost, so you want to start a business. One of the first components is what kind of business do you want to start? So a lot of the session might be things that some folks are already familiar with, but something we've learned is that a lot of faculty or researchers have never started a business before. So there's a lot of unknown unknowns there. So hopefully this illuminates some of those components. So the first choice that you often are going to make if you're going to start a business is choosing the type of business you want to start. So you probably are familiar with the difference between, say, starting a nonprofit and for-profit. Nonprofits are tax exempt, but they can't have ownership. For-profits being small businesses or big corporations. Something folks aren't often as familiar with is if you're going to start a for-profit business, there are still other options and choices you have to make. So a quick review of language. You have LLCs, you have C Corps, you have S Corps. Those are the names of some of the options. But to walk through the theory a little bit, what you're really choosing is what do I want to do with my business and which one is best fit for it. And the variable sort of helping you figure out what that lane is each of those have different types of taxes. They each have different liability structures. So if something goes wrong with the business, whose fault is that? Who has to pay up for that mistake? And what kind of fundraising does it open up? For SBIR, I've seen a lot of different types of organizations go in. But if you're going for something, for example, like chasing venture capital, then there's different elements. So probably the overwhelmingly most common small business in general, so from like laundromats and contracting companies onwards, if you just look at the whole big picture of what choice do most people make, LLCs are often the most common choice. For mom and pop shops, lifestyle businesses, attorneys, service providers, etc. They're really flexible. They're pretty cheap to start. They give you all the protection you need. So rather than like if you have a business and something goes wrong, like the company is typically the one responsible. And so it's one of the big reasons why it's so common, a limited liability corporation. But if you're pursuing something like venture capital, often it's not preferred. And there's some particular reasons why, but one of the biggest ones is it's kind of hard, or at least there's a lot of administrative steps and consequences for selling part of the company. So LLCs, flexible, but maybe not the easiest to sell shares to other people to back the business. Probably the most common one I see for SBIR backed companies that eventually go on to raise venture capital or grow to really large companies is the C Corp. And so, key difference being C cores are a little more expensive to build. They're a little more complicated. They provide a lot of the same protections as an LLC, but they're particularly well designed to issue stocks. So we'll get into this in way more detail in a future session. But if you're doing venture capital, and so you're doing things like a seed round, a Series A round, going public, getting acquired, a lot of those elements, then a C core is often the approach that you want to take. And then finally, probably the least common approach is called an S core. And it's sort of a hybrid in some ways. So it has a lot of the flexibility of an LLC. It's pretty lean, it's quick. It's particularly good on the issue of taxation, and you're able to sell to about 100 owners. So it's sort of a in between the other two options. For a lot of people, the fact that it's in between makes it an attractive option, but I will note it's pretty rare to see S cores. They have really specific use cases, but in all cases, the goal of today's session is not to make you a legal expert that can advise others on which one to choose and know all the differences, but it's good, at least in this very first session, that you hear all the words. There's some amount of thinking in this program that by the end, most things shouldn't feel deeply unfamiliar anymore. You can say like, oh, I know at some point I talked about the difference between LLCs and C Corp. Like if you get to that point by the end of the program, that's at a minimum one of the goals here. But I might pause there because uh, often in at least the mentor sessions that I was helping work on, this is a place where people had questions or they had heard things and curiosities. Does anyone have any questions on sort of this first choice? Ah, venture capital. So one person asked in the chat, what is venture capital? Good question. So you're a founder, maybe you're a researcher or faculty, and you're considering starting a business. A lot of businesses just require a lot of money to actually get up and started. It might be $10 million to acquire the machines or run the experiments or get things off the ground. There are a lot of different options for how you get that $10 million. You could do a research grant, which a lot of people pursue. Venture capital is when essentially you sell part of your company to someone else for that $10 million. So you go out and say, great, if you give me $10 million investor, I will give you 20% of my company. Venture capital refers to sort of that mechanism of the industry that surrounds selling part of your company for the capital to actually build your company over time. We'll be going into way more detail on that, I think weeks 5 and 6, somewhere around there. But that's sort of the basic information. Depending on how you want to get your $10 million, this choice can impact it. Couple other questions in chat. So are LLCs that are taxed as C Corps something like a hybrid between the two? For the most part, they aren't taxed similarly. So C Corps end up under, like in Delaware and under most states, C Corp is your tax designation, essentially. So do you want to be taxed as a C Corp or do you want to be taxed LLC is the choice you're making. There are some fringe cases of things like a C Corp that owns an LLC and sort of really complex structures, but probably the simpler answer is you're usually choosing tax treatment as an LLC or as a C Corp. And then one last question so far in the chat. Can you move from an LLC to a C Corp? Absolutely. It is extremely common to see that as part of someone's plan. So for a lot of folks, they like the, okay, I can go to Zen Business and pay $300. I, in about a week, can go from I don't have a business to I have a fully functioning business up and running, and it's pretty simple. And they start as an LLC, and maybe they do that for 2 or 3 years. Just something that can get funds from the federal government, things along those lines. And that year 3, year 4, whenever they're ready to get venture capital, make that big transition to a big scalable company, there's plenty of law firms that specialize in, oh, so I see you have an LLC and you want to become a C Corp so that you can begin selling shares to investors. It's common. It depends on your position as a company on whether that feels relatively expensive or not. But depending on how you go about it, The recommendation I might make is, so if you are considering doing an LLC now, push off doing a C Corp later, consider talking to some attorneys who are specialized in that practice, because there are a number of law firms who do both of them. They specialize in both starting LLCs and C Corps, and they often have the expertise, or at least their paperwork's designed to pretty easily transition from one to another. You'll see that with boutique firms that either specialize in often startup or small business law, or big law firms that just have 1,000 attorneys in-house, and those sorts of processes designed. But appreciate the vibrant discussion occurring immediately. With a lot of these elements, there are differences cohort to cohort, but this is a place where a lot of folks have had questions in the past. But any other questions or comments from folks about this first choice when it comes to starting a business, which is the what kind do I start as far as a legal and taxation-based organization?
Arsh, how soon, this is Kate Scoffin, how
Yep.
soon should we speak to a lawyer? Like, it's pretty easy, as you said, to get Zen Business to make an LLC.
Yeah.
And then just because I know there's also you have to like make money within 3 years or something like that, those rules. So does it depend how serious you are? If you were to get SBIR or STTR funding, is that considered making money? Can you explain those, or is that coming up?
So it's not necessarily coming up. So I'll sort of split the answer into two parts. What I see most often happen is that by the time someone is getting something like an SBIR, they have some kind of business in place, an LLC or C Corp, whatever it is. That's the beginning of their sort of formal existence. I've seen plenty of companies where essentially the only revenue they had in house was SBIRs for the first 6 or 7 years. They never had customers, they never had anything else, and that seemed to satisfy any revenue requirements involved. As far as the urgency of it, I think it often depends on how far away you are from your SBIR. So if this is your first sort of dipping your toes in the water, you don't know if you're going to apply until 2027, a lot less urgency there. If you're about to hit your first deadline and maybe this is your second time on the application process and you're pretty confident you'll get it soon, a little more urgency. Two things that I will pop up. So for those that are less familiar, two not necessarily recommendations, but to illustrate what they look like in practice. So Zen Business is, I think, the person from Shark Tank, Mark something or other. Anyway, there are a lot of software businesses that automate a lot of it, including the fees, and they're relatively affordable. Zen Business is one that's pretty common for LLCs, and Clerky is probably the most common one when it comes to C Corps and becoming a venture-backed company. So just a quick reference point with regards to some options there. But you often are choosing between, do I go with a law firm that can, talk to me, help me make informed strategic choices, or have I done this before, or do I just need the extreme efficiency? In which case you might go with a Zen Business or a Clerky. With regards, as another question in the chat, with regards to IP, are there differences between the three? So one large caveat I should say with all of this, I went to law school. I've done a lot of like these types of startups and these choices before. This is not legal advice. You should talk to lawyers concerning exact legal advice. But my experience for IP, for a lot of them, is that the agreements you're signing are pretty similar between LLCs and C Corps in particular. So invention assignment agreements, licenses between universities, a lot of those elements seem to be relatively similar in my experience, but that is a IP question. Del, you probably have more experience in tech transfer than me.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was actually trying to type up a message for the IP one, but for IP, it really doesn't, matter if what type of business it is. Particularly whether, it's the inventor. You can be an inventor as a business. You can be an inventor as a person. You don't need a business for that, and even for the assignee. But like Arsh was mentioning, the only real area that it comes into account is if you are set up as a C Corp and you have taken investment money, then those agreements can actually trickle down into whether the venture capital firm or whether whoever also has a controlling stake in the business has a portion of that IP, whether it's control, whether it's revenue from it. That gets into some real super nitty gritty that frankly you ain't going to run into for the next 6 to 7 years. So that's a that's a conversation for further down the road. But as far as like having IP, doesn't matter whatsoever. You don't even need to be a business to have IP. Now you should go to a IP lawyer and talk to them about, if nothing else, about your claims. We are going to cover that. But as far as what business you are and what it means for your IP, doesn't really mean anything for the business type. It's all based on what the agreements say. And to hop in on the next question that is in the chat, it says for opening an LLC, how much paperwork is involved? Very different depending on your state, but for most states. So you do actually have also multiple types of LLCs. You have essentially a group LLC, which is there are 3 or 4 of us that are coming together, and then you have things like a single member LLC. I have a single member LLC for my consulting business. Took me about 5 minutes online to fill out the paperwork. So for most of that stuff, particularly for an LLC, it is very kind of low cost, but also low investment of your time to work through it. Now for things like an S Corp, C Corp that actually require specific types of filings and specific types of articles of incorporation and things that are set up with that, that can be a little bit more costly, both in terms of money as well as time and investment. But for getting an LLC off the ground, nah, anybody should be able to do it, in my eyes.
So to add a little bit to those 2 questions, and then to address a third one in the chat. So agreed, minimal IP differences between LLCs and C Corps. Would recommend reaching out to an IP lawyer or your mentor if you feel like there's a pretty particular difference. An example of when it becomes consequential is if you're building a company whose sole purpose is to have intellectual property, like that's the business, is we have great IP and other people can use it. An LLC might be a lot easier to acquire as a company. C Corp might make it a little bit easier to license it or to like get a stake in just the IP itself. There are some meaningful consequences, probably not the top priority for the many things you're thinking about, but it would behoove us to note that there are some downstream impacts. And for the paperwork, agreed. Again, really differs depending on the situation you have going in. So an example, if you're one PI and you're just doing it yourself and you're not too worried about like every single provision being exactly conceptually clear, Zen business, 5 minutes of answering questions, about an hour from literally beginning to end can get you to where you need, which is really different than 3 people coming in, 2 of whom already own LLCs, and it's sort of a merger situation behind it. It can get a lot more complicated, but yeah, again, talking to your mentor or to an IP lawyer or to a business lawyer can help a lot with those areas. And then to the last question in chat, as presented so far, for IP owned by the university, does it have to be licensed as the inventor? Depends a little bit on what is precisely meant by each of those terms and sort of the context. So I might zoom a little bit out. We are going to talk about tech transfer today, so we'll get this in more detail, and I'll note that. But typically the way it occurs is if you're faculty using university machines and university time and university salary to create some research innovation, what often will occur is the university owns that IP full on in its entirety, and they will license it to some LLC or C Corp, some business outside of it, and there's a agreement there. Different terms can exist of what, like how much, essentially, like what is the value transfer that's going on? Does the licensee, which is to say the company, have exclusive rights? Do they pay the university in equity to have the privilege of using that IP? Do they actually pay them cash? Is it on a one-time or ongoing basis? There's a lot of different choices. Yeah, if that makes sense there. But again, great start to all the questions. I might proceed from here and take another pause point a little later on, but I find that this slide in particular really brings out a lot of the anxieties and questions and curiosities that folks have starting out. So our first choice, we want to start a business. You have often this launching off point. And then there's a lot of operations that follow. So concerning financial operational foundations, you have a company, and let's say the federal government wants to give you $2 million. You probably need a bank account that allows for those funds to be transferred. So again, we're not going to have perfect fluency in these systems, but some things to bear in mind and to have the context of. You probably want to open a dedicated business bank account that's separate from your personal finances. For a lot of those protections that a company has, this is critical. The co-mingling of funds of your personal bank account and funds coming from the government can get really messy and complicated. So you typically want a separate business entity like an LLC or C Corp. Go to a bank. There's tons of banks that are specifically designed for this purpose. So if you did an LLC through Zen Business, they actually set up the bank account through the same interface, which can be kind of nice. Or if you say go through someone like Clerky, they have partnerships with folks like Mercury Bank. But there are a lot of banks that are specifically designed to support businesses, and so lower costs of entry, lower minimum requirements, lower fees, that kind of thing. But you probably want a bank account. You probably want to begin doing some sort of accounting tool. So if you want to say, for example, draw some of that cash for yourself as part of how you want to use those funds you get from an SBIR or whatever it is, QuickBooks or Xero, or I personally use Gusto quite a lot for bookkeeping and tax compliance, because magically, government gives you $2 million. You are going to give that money to some set of contractors and employees. Those contractors and employees getting paid involves a lot of paperwork. By going through a QuickBooks or Xero or Gusto, you make sure that all that paperwork is being done and you don't get dinged for it later on. And the other nice part for going through a lot of those systems is that you can then begin to apply a lot of the financial concepts that matter a lot. So cash flow, burn rate, financial forecasting, things that basically say, we have $2 million on day one. We just got it, excited, we're a startup. You should be able to answer questions like, how long is that $2 million going to last us? Is it going to last us 1 month or 2 years? And does that have consequences like, oh, we probably shouldn't hire too quickly? All those elements. For one of the questions in chat, so this mentioned more about accounting than HR and employees. But Gusto, which I mentioned a moment ago, is the one that I see most often get used. Oh, it's the ad, isn't it? There it is. So I personally use them for a lot of like the startups I use for startups in my accelerator portfolio. This is often who I recommend. They just have a nice platform to make it pretty easy for payroll, HR, and benefits. And so that's the one I often recommend. The other approach I often see people do is just someone in town. So again, if you just want efficiency and simplicity, something like Gusto is pretty attractive. If you're looking for being able to talk with someone and sort of that personal experience, a small business HR firm in town, or even like an H&R Block can be a pretty good option there. But I'll pause there. Around sort of the operations, so we got our tax designation and legal part set up. Now, often the next thing people do is they go and find their bank account and their accounting and sort of those systems. Any other questions on that, kind of like the HR question? Any questions in that sort of operational side of house?
Don't have a question myself, but one of the things that I'd like to let everybody know is that, and Arsh brought it up when he talked about, the government wants to give you essentially like $2 million as a small startup. Actually, from state to state, it can depend on whether that money has to be reported as income for the business and be taxed as income, or whether it is non-taxed. I really recommend everybody. So within your state, there will be a Secretary of State website. Go to your Secretary of State website and actually look for that information, because as Arsh is talking about, like setting up your accounting tools, setting up your bookkeeping, setting up stuff like that, that is something you're going to want to know, because that will change kind of how you arrange some of your accounts in QuickBooks or something like that. Because if you have to actually pay taxes on that $2 million, it's very different than if you don't have to pay taxes as being a government grant.
Yeah, and it is one of the benefits of having a small business firm or something along those lines walk you through it, because a Gusto or a Clerky or a Zen Business isn't going to tell you the following type of sentence, which is not only do some states take your SBIR money and treat it as income that you were taxed for, SBIR often won't let you use the money itself to pay the tax. So you, for example, got $2 million. It's taxable. Let's say you owe $100,000 in taxes. You're going to have to go find that $100,000 often somewhere other than the SBIR funds to actually pay the bill, so to speak. And again, highly depends on situations, but like those are the kind of things that a small business HR, payroll, accounting team can help you catch, and can be really stressful if you don't have. A couple other questions in the chat. So could you compare the pros and cons for setting up a business in Delaware versus your home state? Yeah, this is Delaware historically. So I would say this is changing a little bit at the moment, which is a little strange because this advice has been true for decades at this point. But for decades, if you were starting particularly a VC-backed like company, something that is growing really fast, is getting investment dollars, is trying to become a billion-dollar company, the de facto was that you were going to be incorporated in Delaware. The reason behind that is that for most of the VC-backed ecosystem, all the venture capitalists, all the startups, even a lot of some of the corporations, like uh, Meta or like folks in that sort of space, they're fluent in Delaware law. They're not necessarily fluent in the laws of Minnesota or Oregon or Kentucky or Tennessee. So it was extremely common and is still extremely common to set up a Delaware C Corp. That way, if there's ever a lawsuit between you and some investor, whatever it is, the lawyers feel pretty strong and fluent and conversational in that law. Some of the disadvantages, Delaware's expensive. They essentially made a business model of we're going to make our state highly conducive to business. We're going to make everything pretty easy, but also we're going to make sure that our state gets some revenue. So a concrete example, the Delaware franchise tax for C Corps can get kind of pricey, where a lot of states are just way cheaper when it comes to the taxes you'll end up paying. So key insight for Delaware versus home is often trade-off between legal ease and sort of like streamlined approach versus the full taxation amount you might be responsible for in that state. There are some kind of like the question earlier on, can I transition from an LLC to a C Corp? If you're about to raise $2 or $10 million, some VCs will help you make the transition of, I see that you're a Minnesota C Corp. We really want you to be a Delaware C Corp, and they can help you potentially navigate that change. And there's some number of states that mirror the laws against what's in Delaware. So again, nuances depending on what situation you're in. Does another question in chat? Does SBIR require financial software or official accounting as you progress through to phase 2, phase 3, etc.? Oh, it looks like Dell responded. So I'll just read it out because I don't know if the chat always comes through in the recordings. So Dell's comment for the financial software question on SBIR. It is something you will want to do in the future, particularly for phase 2 and beyond, because you will want to set up specific regulations to follow to get your agency approved indirect rate. At NIH, it varies by the student center on the requirement for accounting software. So it's not something you have to apply, but if it looks like you are going to be awarded, you will want to get that set up. And I've found the same to be true on my side. It's easy enough to talk to a SBIR, STTR consultant on like, what is the correct range for something like an indirect rate? Is it 50% of all your salary? Is it 15% of your MDR, some other acronym? And as long as you answer the questions in the right way, they're not going to typically make that a barrier. But at some point, they expect you to deliver. So if you said, we're going to have the following indirect rate, here's how it's set up. Whenever you use all the funds, you'll have to be able to demonstrate the fact that you followed consistent with the budget that you outlined in the proposal. So would agree with the advice. Aim for answering the right questions, but like, do you need to have all of the systems set up and ready to run at the time of applying? Probably not. But certainly by the time you've finished deploying the funds, you would expect for that to have been set up. Oh, and that the second part for NIH was a comment from Chris, just as a attribution there. But any other questions on sort of core financial and operational foundations for a business? If not, can move through the third component, which is essentially the team. So far in our journey of the fundamentals, we started our LLC or C Corp or business in any case. We even opened up our bank account. We have payroll up and running. We can pay 1099 contractors, etc. Then gets the question of like, oh, right, we got the $2 million for the business. It's in the bank account. I can do all of these things. The question then becomes, how do I actually go about getting a co-founder, hiring my first employee, hiring a contractor, making sure all of those elements are set up? And this, again, isn't going to make you fluent in the process, but some things you should be aware of is that each of those have pretty different agreements. So a co-founder agreement where they're getting equity is pretty different than a first hire where they're just getting cash, and you want to make sure any intellectual property they develop is owned by the business, which is a little different than an advisor who's doing a tiny bit of equity, no cash, but you want to get some agreements. And so a couple comments in the chat that I'll verbalize. So comment from Chris. Reminder that when you set up your company to be eligible for SBIR STTR, it must be greater than 50% owned and operated by US citizens or permanent residents. So example of a place where you can sort of get in trouble immediately. Let's say that you have two people. You decide to go through the Delaware C Corp approach. One of them is a Canadian citizen, no US particular affiliation. You've worked with them for a long time at research labs. If they own 51% of the company and the US citizen you owns 49% of the company, you are no longer eligible for the SBIR or STTR program. That is a key requirement, is that this is America's seed fund for the United States. And the way that they illustrate that in practice is they're going to look at what's referred to as a cap table, but just a spreadsheet of who owns the company. And they are going to want to see that greater than 50% are owned and operated by US citizens. For the question in chat, do you need to be a full-time employee of a company to apply for an SBIR? I do think it depends on what agency you're applying for what those exact requirements are. The short and I think most common answer is yes. In particular, the principal investigator working on the project, depending on what you're doing, often it needs to be, but there's a lot of exceptions. STTR at certain agencies, I don't think is a way to not have that be required. Oh, and yeah, full-time meaning what is meant by full-time. Greater than 50% is often the requirement, and specifically greater than 50%, and you aren't working somewhere else more than 19.6 hours, I think is often the number full-sided. But Del, do you have any other comments there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, quick reminder for people too, it depends on whether you're doing an SBIR or an STTR, as Arsh mentioned. On an STTR, technically the PI can come from the small business, but when you're talking about the full-time employee, it's really for the PI themselves. They have to be employed 51% or greater than 51%. It's 51%. Some agencies are 19.6 hours, some are 21 hours, some are this really weird thing, but just 51% or more. They have to be employed full-time by the business. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to give 51% of their time to the actual project or the grant itself. We'll dive real deeply into that weeks like 8 when we get into SBIR and STTR and kind of talk about the differences. But one other thing is when we're talking about the application, you actually don't have to have those in place for the application, but you would have to have them in place for an award. Because what'll happen, and again, preview of what's to come, what'll happen is the agency will actually essentially reach out and say, hey, we want to give you money. You need to verify these things for us, which is called the just-in-time process. When they do the just-in-time, that's when you'll actually need to show that these people either are currently employed by the business or will be currently employed by the business in the immediate future. And that's when you actually have to have employees. So, from a startup standpoint, like going after, these funds, you don't really need to have, essentially quote unquote money in the bank. You can actually just start off, really slow, really fresh, put together a proposal, send it in, see if it gets awarded. But if they want to give you money, then you have to be a business. You have to start playing the business ball game.
Oh, I have no idea what the answer is for the last one. And it's an interesting case, which is again more than one. So if like you go for the DOE and an NIH and there's a PI assigned to both of them, I'm not sure.
So what happens with that is that, and this is also particularly for NIH, part of their just-in-time process. Some agencies, you'll actually fill out this form before that with the application, but you'll fill out something called a current pending and support. So if you are doing more than one SBIR, the person still has to be employed, greater than 51%. But when you fill out the current pending and support, it's actually a listing of all SBIR, federal awards, federal monies that the business or the person is obligated under. And on that, you'll actually put the percentage of time that that person's obligated. So for like an NIH phase one, let's say you have 30%. And then you also submit to like DOE and they give you an award and you have 40%. Well, then across those awards, you only now have 30% of time that can actually be dedicated for that particular person, because you can't go over 100%. Federal government does not, well, anyways, federal government does not believe in anything over a 40-hour work week. So you can't go, well, I'm 51% of my business, but I still carry this job, with the university, for a 3-class load, work 36 hours, but I'm still, 40 hours with my business because I'm working 80 hours a week. That don't fly. 40 hours. And that's why it's kind of also that cutoff on when they say 51%, they're actually talking about within a 40-hour work week.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think, well, Deli can speak to it, but I think it's related to dedication to grant, at least in that binary.
Yeah, I think we're getting in the weeds a little bit here, and a lot of this will be covered when we specifically talk about SBIR. So maybe we try to just focus on, Arsha's presentation of overall company structure and then think about how it impacts SBIR a little bit later.
Yeah, makes sense. So maybe I'll circle back to sort of a top level, like ways in which that applies to fundamentals, and then punt it to experts of Chris and Del, who are speaking at quite a great length of the specific politics and nuances of how to navigate the application. But the top level answer, typically for your SBIR or STTR, you're going to hire someone as the PI. They'll be working there a majority, at least, of their general employment. There's some nuances of how that gets counted. We'll go over later, but circle back. So whether it's the PI for your application that you want to hire as a full-time employee, or a co-founder where you're giving equity, or an advisor, there are specific agreements for each. If you're using something like Clerky, one of those pieces of software that automates a lot of this, it can often be quite helpful. So on Clerky, the way it works is you just choose like, oh, I'm bringing on a co-founder. And it just walks you through a bunch of automated forms of like, okay, how much ownership of the company will this co-founder have? Are they expected to work full time? Are they getting cash? And it sort of helps process the paperwork. Or for something like an advisor, there's all kinds of automated or common practices for all of these. So the Founders Institute has a typical one that's used for advisors where, so you want to give your advisor some amount of equity. What's normal? Is it 0.5% of your company? Is it 2%? And it often depends. But question that you can certainly feel free to reach out to me for, or your mentor, is I want to bring someone onto the team. There's questions of timing. When do you bring on people over time? Often co-founders are relatively early. Advisors are somewhere in the middle, employees are somewhat later, and what are the actual forms that you are going to have them sign? For example, across the board, there are questions like, do you need them to have signed NDAs or CIIAs, confidentiality agreements, and invention assignments? There's a whole package, and the thing to come away from this session for is just remember, when you're bringing someone on the team, there's a whole package of things that have to happen in terms of paperwork, and you'll want to be mindful that you're not having your advisor essentially sign the co-founder agreement stuff, or you're not going to have your employees sign the advisor style agreements. And then one more just to verbalize in the chat from the conversation we were having a second ago. So from Donald, the 51% is commitment to the company. How it gets paid is more relevant to the grant. 20% of pay from NIH, 20% from an NSF SBIR, 15% paid to the company, etc. So teeing up some of that future conversation. But from there, we can continue to sort of chart across the story. So You've started your company, you've set up all your systems for payroll, etc. You even recruited some people to actually go and do that work. Then there's the getting the work done. Something that you might hear a lot is just all the various software suites designed to help people actually get the work done. So that you have Trello boards, you have Asana for project management, or Jira for managing tickets. There's all kinds of systems, and Slack and Notion, etc. But just some awareness that the way you get work done within the context of a university using Overleaf to co-write your papers often is a different software suite than what startups typically use to assign tasks and get them done. Often this will invite questions like standard operating procedures. So when you're doing hiring at startups, it often be kind of loose and quick, where it's just like, I met the right person, I'm just going to onboard them immediately. And it can at least provide some, or it can lead to some risk if you're not at least somewhat consistent. So if 2 out of your 5 hires are people that you just hired without any sort of process, and for 3 of them, they had to go through 4 interviews, 3 reference checks, and 6 months of process, it can lead to some inconsistency that can lead to some risk. And finally, there is just a whole web of compliance. If this feels a little bit intimidating, it's because some of it a little bit is. A lot of folks are pretty comfortable with I'm a startup founder. I found a problem to solve. I can go solve that problem and I just need the resources to do it. And often there is just all of the infrastructure of how businesses work in practice, from incorporation to accounting to employment laws, data privacy, and industry regulations. One of the reasons so many dollars end up getting spent on something other than the core research, the core product, is that this involves a lot of expertise to just not get dinged for operating outside of where one should be. For the question in the chat, I'll continue to at least try to provide short answers and note whenever we'll be doing longer answers later on. Can the work be done in the PI's lab at the university? So for STTRs, that's often the way that they're structured. So short answer, totally possible. We'll go into more detail of where the work gets done and how that impacts what type of application that one makes. But any other questions on sort of you've incorporated, you have all the components involved, like how do you actually go about running the company? Okay. So question in the chat, will you be talking about COI regarding research PI employed at the university being the owner of the company? I believe so. I believe Dell and Chris will speak at greater length on the differences between STTR and SBIR, which is to say you're just a business doing your research versus you're doing this in partnership with the university. So those cascading effects. So I'm not the domain expert there and can't say, at least with assurance, that we'll be going way more in detail, and particularly the second half of the program around those kinds of questions. But Del?
Yeah, and I was going to say, for the portion about the conflict of interest, that really depends on the conversation between the business. So you kind of have to recuse yourself as an employee of the university, and the conversation between the tech transfer office at your university. Because all of this is going to run through the tech transfer office. You may hear about, oh, well, talk to this person, talk to this person. That's fine. You can talk to them people, but every decision is going to run through the tech transfer office, because I ran a tech transfer office for a while. I know kind of how that works. And they are going to have very specific requirements, and it's going to be in kind of the bylaws and guidance of the university on, as a professor, what type of outside activities can you do? Can you actually start a business? And that's going to be the kind of tipping point for you personally in your growth as a business person, your growth as an entrepreneur, is when do I make the decision that I have to step away from the university and actually, run my business, be an employee of my business. But again, that's going to be very, very dependent on what your university actually requires. And you can find out all that information through the tech transfer office at your university.
And 2 quick notes there. So we will talk a little bit about like how tech transfer works, which I think you're right, will like illuminate that at the end of today's session, actually. So we'll get into a lot of more details and weeds later on, but we will at least set the foundation of like, what is tech transfer? When do I talk to them and what do I talk to them about? And to Danielle's question, do we need a physical address/office to start a small business? Lots of people use their home residence. There's trade-offs of that approach, but you often will need a address. It's the required component of virtually all the forms. Some people are able to just sign up for a co-working space. Most people can't successfully just do like a small box at like USPS, a PO box. But the short answer is yes, you'll need an address. And depending on where you are, that can range from your personal home to your university might have an accelerator that can use their address. You can get a co-working space. There's some options, but Chris?
Yeah, sorry, Arsh. For if you're going to do SBIR, sam.gov, the primary registration that's required, does not accept PO boxes.
PO boxes. Yep.
So I always recommend using your home address. That way you're going to get the mail and you can change it later. But as far as SBIR, it's the easiest one to use.
And to hop on with what Chris was saying, there are actually like virtual addresses you can get for your business. Personally, I have a virtual address because I ain't mixing any of that stuff. But going through, as Chris just mentioned sam.gov, a lot of times sam.gov and some of these other agency systems don't like virtual addresses, because typically the virtual address will be street number, street, suite, and then a number, and you have multiple businesses that are within that like suite, whatever. So it's probably better to, you don't have to actually go out and buy some space. You can actually use, like, as Arsh mentioned, your home address. There's kind of trade-offs with that, but you can a lot of times fight through the system to get a virtual address. You just have to kind of work within the confines of sam.gov to get that registration in place.
Yeah, and we'll say, like, I run a university accelerator. This is not the sexy service we offer by any stretch of the imagination, but like it is a real barrier for a lot of folks of like, I just need a physical address so I don't get like stuck, like the works don't get gummed up. So if you like look around your local ecosystem, often there's someone willing to, at as affordable rate as they can, help solve that problem. For two questions, or one comment in the chat, and then one question. Universities often require disclosure that you started a business, for sure. We'll get into a little bit of that for tech transfer, but it's mostly outside the scope. For a lot of folks, if you currently have an employer, university or otherwise, you will have to follow all the policies they have. This often differs depending on what you're doing. For universities, it's closer to like, we want to make sure there's not a conflict of interest, as noted. For others, it's just once you own more than a 5% stake in the company, then you disclose it. If you're already talking to check transfer, then it's sometimes a little less formal. If you're talking through like really formal channels, depending on your department, it can be more formal. Last question in the chat, and then I can move towards a little bit of the methodology part of the conversation. What are the cons of using home addresses? At least some of them are. A lot of this information becomes pretty public in some meaningful ways. So like I have often used my personal address for businesses that I started. And it just means that my home address is really easy to find online, because you look up the companies I'm part of, you look up the physical address, and sometimes, like particularly for older businesses, you see an apartment number. People could just like come knock on my door if they wanted to come talk to me about my business, or if they wanted to send me spam, etc. There's probably other trade-offs that come to mind, but a lot of them follows the thread of that the like company business address ends up becoming something like a public piece of knowledge, and all the cons that come from being that public on the internet. But from there, and again, we'll just keep saying, really appreciate the deep engagement of this first session. It's a little bit different than how we've done past cohorts, and I'm really excited that we can immediately dig into so many of those elements. But following the course of our sort of startup journey together, we started the business, we got our systems in place, we hired a couple of people, and we're even beginning to go through compliance and some of those elements. At some point, hopefully, you've gone through all of the sort of back-end logistical components and you start building something. Here is a methodology introduction that probably a lot of folks have heard, but lean startup methodology is a method often used in startups that you don't always find within universities, research, academia. And the key phrases you often see is build, measure, learn cycles, or launching an MVP, testing product market fit, minimizing risk. A whole bunch of jargon that I think is well illustrated by one graph and the story that accompanies it. So if you look in the 80s and 90s for product development, and in many ways, how some amount of academic development still occurs, they use what's referred to as a waterfall method. So in other words, you have some brilliant idea, some intellectual piece of property that you're curious about. And you just decide to start building. You realize like, okay, so it'll take 18 months to get all the experiments run, get all the machines, build everything. And over that time, you spend the first 6 months like acquiring machines, another 6 months running the experiments, another 6 months building your perfect product that you can envision so easily. At the very end of that, there's a chance, like a lot of companies do, where no one wants your perfect thing. At no point, like, did you necessarily talk to a customer about it, show it to other people. It sort of existed within the possibility that you could build it. And so you acquired a ton of risk. You launched your product 18 months later. It took hundreds of millions of dollars maybe to build. No one wants it. And now you have a failed product. The premise of agile development and a lot of the build, measure, learn cycles is okay, a lot of that risk essentially just came from assumptions that built up over time. The assumption that customers wanted a certain thing, that they wanted it a certain way, they wanted to distribute it. All of those assumptions stacked up into a ton of risk. And it was only when you launch your product that all your assumptions got validated or invalidated. And suddenly the risk has dropped to zero. Risk or uncertainty. The build, measure, learn cycle just means that you are constantly validating the assumptions over time. So before you do anything, okay, like what do customers actually want? I should go ask them about what problem they want. Great. How would they want that delivered to them? Is it a hardware solution? Is it a software solution? Can they buy it on Amazon or do I directly ship it to them? And if you constantly go about those quick cycles of what's the next question or I need to answer or assumption I need to validate or invalidate, then suddenly you're only taking little bets. So maybe you made the wrong bet. I bet people would buy this on Amazon. I'm curious about that. So you launch on Amazon and you realize, nope, no one bought on Amazon. Everyone just wants it shipped to them. Great. You spent a little bit of time, a little bit of effort, a little bit of money, and then you dropped the risk back below. But in startups, and particularly the development of products, what you're often spending your weeks actually doing is these rapid turnarounds of what's the next milestone? How do I actually execute that? And how do I get my risk dropped back down to zero? The way I've heard it said occasionally is that founders are often labeled as these renegade deep risk takers. And a lot of the most successful founders I know are deeply risk averse. They are people who are constantly just trying to, as quickly as possible, drop risk back down to zero. That way they're not wasting their efforts, because all the wasted effort means moving more slowly, moving less effectively, and losing to a competitor. Oh, and drawing us back just very briefly to the conversation beforehand, zoning requirements can be pretty complicated when it comes to where to incorporate your home. So we'll make that note real quick. Yeah, and that gets us sort of through a crash course in things that people have probably mentioned to you when it comes to starting a business, from legally incorporating to running the operations, the back end, to actually going about building the thing that solves problems. That's sort of the end-to-end introduction of a lot of words that we'll go through in a lot more detail through mentorship and sessions. But any overall questions in sort of this front-loaded set of vocab and concepts? If not, we have plenty of content to cover and a finite amount of time to cover it. Let me actually make sure. One item. Perfect. So we have about a half hour left. Wanted to remember if it was half an hour. So one question in between the sections. So do I need to do market analysis for my product before I open my company? And who can help with this? Maybe. I will say most startups don't actually succeed at finding their ideal market immediately. And so for a lot of them, they start their company well before knowing precisely what product or market they're going to launch with. As for people who can help you with market analysis, your mentors in this program are a good bet, but we will talk way more about customer discovery and market analysis over the course of this program. But moving on to somewhat that area, we do begin to introduce the ideas that we'll expand upon throughout the program. So a nice transition into the next subject matter around defining the business and actually getting started. So all of the first part was really logistical and frameworks. This section is going to be a little bit more about, okay, but what do I actually do? There is some amount of design work of how do you design your company to actually work in practice. So market research and value proposition. a lot of academics have an intuitive understanding of there being a gap. There is some amount of research, but the research is in column A and column C, and really there's a gap. There's an understudied question somewhere in the conceptual space. Companies are similar, except that they're often looking at a problem space. There's plenty of products out there. They solve problems A and problem C, but actually if you're doing problem B, it's not very useful at all. And so there is a fundamental design component outside of all the back-end logistics, which is how do I go find a gap where I can actually solve a real problem? Some of the more common ways to go about it is go talk to people. Customer interviews is the key word that you'll often look up for how to go about this. But so you want to help a group of people that experience a certain disease. Great, go talk to 100 of them, ask them, how did that get treated? Were you satisfied with the experience? What was the worst part? And that'll give you a rich understanding to where like, oh, for 80% of this population that experienced the following disease, this was the worst part, and they'd be willing to pay out of pocket to have that problem solved. And there is sort of a variety of instruments available, and often roughly depends on what kind of problem you're solving. But you often start just talking to a lot of individuals. Maybe you get a group of them to come talk to you, and then eventually you want to generalize it. So you do a survey of that large population. But there is that methodology of talk to one person, talk to a group of people, do a random sample size to validate the generalization. The other component is if you're looking for keywords for how to go about that market research, a really popular one that in the last 10 years or so is the jobs to be done framework. And it's essentially okay, are you actually sure that you know what your product solves? So the anecdote that like is accompanied by is what is the job of a milkshake is the common example given. And for a lot of people, they would say, well, the job of a milkshake is to be sweet and tasty and to not fill me up too much because it's a dessert. But if you actually went and talked to people who specifically had milkshakes at McDonald's, the answer that they often gave is, oh, milkshakes are my meal in the morning. I have one pretty much every morning because it's filling. I can drink one on the way to work. It is something I can hold with one hand while I'm driving, and it holds me over until lunch. And so one critical component of all of this is it's a lot harder to get right than one expects. Even something as simple as a milkshake. If you actually go talk to your customers, do focus groups and surveys, you'll begin to realize that the way you design your product has to be responsive to the actual problem you're solving. Because for McDonald's in that case study related to jobs to be done, what they did was, well, if it's supposed to be dessert and small, we should decrease the calories and increase the sweetness. That's how we improve milkshakes. And they saw a huge drop in the number of people who wanted it because suddenly the milkshakes were too big. You had to have two hands to hold it. It was too sweet. It didn't really meet the need of a quasi breakfast item, etc. But again, no need to be fluent in these ideas, but it should give you some introduction to particularly the answer to that question of how do you do market analysis? Often you want to start small, talk to actual people who experience things before you go large and begin studying the bigger picture. Some other components that you'll want to think about in this survey of fundamental business concepts is a business model. So you have this brilliant breakthrough innovation. You can get some SBIR funding to actually build the product, get it launched onto the market. At some point, it's a business and the business has to make money. And so you'll want to have some sense of how do you think you're actually going to make money? And some key terms that can introduce a framework for different ways you can make money include who are you selling to? B2B refers to business. So your business is selling to other businesses. So in this case, a common example is something like the examples we gave earlier. So Zen Business, Clerky, Gusto, they are all pieces of software that often sell to startups. In this cases, you're meeting with a bunch of CEOs to convince them of like, hey, for your company, you're currently spending the following dollars on HR. You should spend it on us instead. One of the key components of B2B is that often you can have 5 clients, each of whom are $1 million. And suddenly you have a pretty large and successful business, but it might have taken a year or 2 to land those 5 clients. But B2B is a common one where you're getting other businesses to often help you land pretty large contracts. B2C, so your business is selling directly to some consumer. It's pretty common for things like food products, beverages. You're not meeting with CEOs all day. You're trying to contact the general consumer base. So let's say that you're selling a vegan treat. Great. You want to be in Whole Foods, you want to be in Amazon, you want to be wherever you are, but you want to sell to 1 million individuals, each of whom decide to choose your vegan treat rather than someone else's. Key language you're looking for there is B2C. And then probably the most common one I see for particularly biotech, medical devices, SBIR that comes through NIH is licensing or partnerships. So you've made some molecule, you've made some new methodology for delivering drugs, whatever it is. You end up going to big pharma or someone else, and they're like, great, we already have 1 billion customers. For about 1 million of them, they care about your product giving them a slightly better advantage. Me, big pharma, will pay you 2% of the royalties that come from that existing product. And it's a really different thing than selling to CEOs, selling to individuals. Instead, now you're reaching out to big industry giants who think that your method or your IP is of value, and they will pay you money to tap into that intellectual property that you've developed. But I'll pause there for a moment. So we talked a little bit about customer discovery. How do you actually solve real problem in the market? And the different part of who's your customers. How do you actually make money as a business? But any comments or questions about the making money part of the business? If not, can go through a couple of other key concepts. Oh, Chris?
I have a question. What do you think about sort of starting out with a B2B model and then moving B2C, or starting B2C and then moving B2B?
Yeah, I will say most companies, and certainly the ones that I founded, choose wrong initially. You think you're a B2B company, you're secretly B2C. You start B2C, and eventually you get tired and you want to go licensing. It is common that you iterate over time. It's essentially like a hypothesis. You form a hypothesis, you validate and validate it, and then you move on. So a concrete example, for a company like Zen Business, it really sounds like they're B2B. It sounds like they help other businesses get off the ground. And so for a long time, like those types of companies were trying to sell to other companies. But they realized eventually it was like, oh no, we're pretty much a B2C company. All like 80% of the people we work with are individuals with single person LLCs who are willing to spend $500 on us to help set up their business. And so for them, it seemed really obvious that we help businesses get started. Certainly we're B2B. It's like, oh, but in practice, we serve one-person companies, which is basically a B2C approach. It's pretty easy in some ways to transition depending on how early stage you are from one hypothesis to another. And often it's essentially a story that you build and learn over time. Question in chat, which I think is one of the most common ones for this program in particular. So what about molecules, drugs, etc., that can be used both as a therapeutic and also for basic research? Are these almost two different businesses? Kind of. So there are plenty of companies that have some B2B revenue streams, some B2C, and some licensing and partnerships. One concrete example is for folks in the like molecule or drug space that focus on skincare, they will often have some product that is direct to consumer of, yeah, didn't cost that much. We found a developer in South America that's willing to like put our ingredient into their existing skin product and sell it directly to consumers. And we get a lot of feedback and brand credibility in that way. While on the side, talking to big pharma and saying, see, like we've demonstrated the following benefits. We only have 1,000 customers, but they are 6 times as engaged as a competitor. So you have this balance of working for the B2C approach, directly selling to folks, even though it's not that many, to demonstrate some fact, and then using that fact to build these really high commercializable licenses and contracts. Some other questions. The university owns the IP and my company wants to go for licensing and partnerships, how this works. A lot of universities will directly help. And I'll mention that a little bit more in tech transfer. But a lot of universities sit on a huge patent portfolio, and they're often wanting to directly license those out to major companies or to work with a university spinout or a startup to be sort of an intermediary heading into licensing. It depends on the exact agreement you're going with, but that's one of the key terms. So like, let's say you have a university, you have a startup, Startup licenses the IP from the university, and then the startup licenses it to another organization. A pretty common clause in something like that is if, like, for all the revenue that the startup's getting, licensing to big pharma and big organization, a small cut of it goes back to the university. So $100 million deal between startup and big pharma for the following molecule, 2%, $2 million feeds back to the university is one arrangement. Oh, and then a vibrant chat, and I'll try to capture and follow some of it. Another example to differentiate B2B and licensing partnerships. So a example that comes to mind is essentially like the work of innovation. So if you, for example, had a piece of software that made a process 10 times more efficient, let's say that you're doing video compression and your piece of software, like your code, makes that really efficient, you could start your own platform, your own competitor to Vimeo or YouTube or whatever it is, and see if you can just beat them in terms of we're cheaper than everyone else, so we can offer a better service. Or you could just license it to Vimeo or YouTube, and they pay you a big like dollar contract. Licensing, often you're now part of the machine that someone else has built, versus B2B, you built the machine yourself. But Del?
I was just going to jump in, and what Arsh just gave us a really great example. But another example is a lot of times when you are developing somewhere that is, or something that is like a piece of hardware, like I'm building this new widget, this new gear that Schwinn and everybody from mountain bikes is going to love, but I don't have the facilities. So what I do is I set up a license or a partnership with a production company or a production manufacturer, supplier, distributor, that, and say, okay, you're going to produce this, when I get paid, then, or, whatever the agreement looks like, they are actually kind of licensing or partnering with me to produce it so that they get part of the profit, I get part of the profit / revenue. That's actually something that happens quite a lot when you're developing or building something physical, because as a small startup, it takes millions upon millions of dollars to set up a manufacturing line. You ain't got that money for that, because particularly with like SBIR and even with like venture capital, they don't want you to plunk down $5 million to set up a manufacturing facility, when, as Arsh mentioned, you don't really know who's going to buy this or why they're going to buy it. So that's actually a kind of good example there too, is a lot of like hardware stuff, you're going to have a license or a partnership with that manufacturer / distributor / supplier. And that's why it's different than you like directly selling it.
And for the other comment in the question, or comment in the chat, so is B2G, business to government, somewhat different? I'm working on a diagnostic test for local health, so very few businesses would be the customer and would not be really appropriate for B2C given the nature of the disease. Yes, I will say a lot of B2G ends up operating pretty similar to B2B. For SBIR stuff, I see this in particular happen a lot with Department of Defense SBIR programs, where the phase 3, I think, for DoD often is a contract with the Navy or with the military or with aerospace. So you developed your technology, began piloting it, and primarily agencies of the US government are the primary contract that you will secure by the end. But it's similarly, like, you're not talking to 1,000 people, you're talking to 20 heads of various agencies or teams within US government. It's a pretty long sales cycle. There's lots of like hoops to jump through, but once you land it, it's often quite a high dollar amount. So most of the analogies in B2B work pretty well for B2G. Question in chat that I think will be probably covered better by some other people in other sessions, but if my invention is a molecule, who is in charge of clinical trials? Depends, SBIR, STTR, and who your PI is, and sort of those elements. But we'll be going into more detail over time of the logistics of how to actually execute an SBIR, STTR. But with 18 minutes remaining, we'll make sure we make time, particularly for the tech transfer component. So quick note on just MVPs and competitor analysis. So we've talked so far a lot about, okay, so I found a customer group, they have a problem, I can solve them, great. We've talked about like, how does it actually make money? The last component is that you do exist in a market of other components. So other than talking to your customers, other than like making money, you often want to be able to pretty quickly figure out, is this a real gap in the market? Who else is there trying to solve this problem? In what ways am I actually different? Because something that's pretty common is you think you're particularly innovative in your approach until you really look to see how many other people are working on the problem. And you might find 5 people doing identical work. But maybe there's a minor difference between them, or maybe you can just execute and build faster than them. It doesn't always mean that there's no route available. Those are 3 fundamental analyses that you'll do a lot more of throughout this program, but are good to know, which is to say, actually do some market research to figure out if you're solving a problem at all. Make sure the way that you solve that problem has some ability to make money so your business can keep existing. And 3, make sure that you exist within the market overall. Who else is there? What are their strengths or weaknesses? What are the opportunities and threats for you? And as far as what MVP is, a minimum viable product. So in the chart that we went through a little bit earlier, each time you run an experiment, often you don't want to spend 18 months to validate or test a hypothesis. You want something kind of scrappy. So it is, oh, I wonder if users of like people with the following disease actually care about the following. Put up a web page, run an A/B test, get 1,000 people in like of your group to look at web page A versus web page B and see if they click at different rates. But an MVP is often just something that you can use to test one of these hypotheses. So maybe it's not the prim and polish perfect product, but a minimum viable product is just something that's good enough to validate one of these assumptions, in particular, your ability to solve a problem. But with that, let's see, about 15 minutes left. Maybe I'll open up any questions about MVPs, competitor analysis, that sort of arc of concepts for how to actually design your company to solve a problem, make money, succeed. I'll say one last quick note on that, and then proceed, which is very much drinking from the fire hose on this first session. Lots of folks were frustrated that basically they heard one of these phrases once in the program, went really deeply into it, not again. So part of the design of this first session is you're going to hear all the words up front, and we're going to continue to hammer in and dive more deeply into a lot of the areas. But Del?
I was just going to say to kind of reinforce Arsha's point, a lot of these we're going to dive into more, but for all of these things, it's going to be really dependent on you, the business, where you want to be, and going to be kind of those personal decisions. We're going to give you information about how to make those decisions, but in practice, like doing a SWOT analysis or something like that, or going after like feedback, and your universities will almost always have some sort of entrepreneur hub or some sort of business development hub. They can be a really great source for, I need to figure this out. Do you have interns or, graduate students that will work with me over the semester to do this? Or a lot of them will run like mini boot camps, or, they'll actually have like an I-Core hub where you don't have to go to like the national I-Core program, but they'll have like an I-Core hub or an I-Core site or something like that, where it'll kind of just give you these and have someone that'll work with you on the, okay, well, when you're doing a SWOT analysis, here's how you actually walk through it and the mechanics, because a lot of these topics would be like a week in and of itself. Like even doing a SWOT analysis, that's an entire presentation and a week of working with people. So we're going to cover a lot of that introductory information and then build on it. But if you want to dive in like super deep, use your resources. It's public funds, or use your universities. Public funds, they have the resources, tap into them. Even as a professor, you can go, I just want to know more about this because I might be interested in this in the future. And a lot of them will go, yeah, sure, let's talk about this. Let's work through this.
Yeah, and fully second that. But with our last 13 minutes, we'll jump a little bit into University Spinouts and then sort of what do I do with this deluge of information, setting us up for where to go from here. But for university, Spinouts. So specifically what I'm referring to is, say you're a researcher or faculty at a university, you come with some breakthrough and you want to start your own business. Based on that breakthrough, apply for SBIR, see if you can become a founder of growing startup. Tech transfer is probably one of the most fundamental words and phrases that you want to know in this process. So if you used university resources, salary, time, machines, etc., the university tends to own that intellectual property that's related to it. If as a faculty you ended up with one of those breakthroughs, so software, hardware, biology, whatever the case is, you tend to have to disclose it. So there's some form that you submit with your tech transfer office, who oversees a lot of this. And then the responsibility of tech transfer is often great. Like, we as a university have a duty to take our innovations that could positively transform the world and actually turn those into something that generate revenue and have that impact. And so they're a key audience across all of this. For you all, they're the ones that own the intellectual property and the people you want to talk to when it comes to licensing that to your startup or commercializing it. In particular, the key conversation or transaction that you have is negotiating some kind of license agreement. So the university owns the IP. You started your own small business on the side. The university is willing to often license that intellectual property method to the small business to use. Bunch of different elements that are part of that. So is there a royalty payment? So for every $1 million of revenue you make, you have to send us $100,000 or $10,000. Is there an equity stake? Does the university just own part of your company? And is it contingent on something called a commercialization milestone? Are you obliged to not just sit on the intellectual property for 10 years, but you actually have to build the product, get one customer, generate $100,000 in revenue? These are all key negotiating components that you'll talk about in your licensing agreements, along with maybe one of the most important features, which is it an exclusive license? Does your startup have this intellectual property and no one else can use it? Or are you just one of many startups or many companies that can use it as one of those components? There's a deep amount of strategy and negotiation that goes through all of this, from how does this set you up for your future funding? How does it set up with your support from your university, et cetera? I will mention one thing, which is the autumn model IIA. Yeah, model IIA interinstitutional agreement. And it's essentially a bunch of tech transfer from across the country got together to build some kind of norms or set of norms and language with regards to all this. So kind of like how Delaware as a state normalized a lot of how business gets done for tech startups. Autumn model IIA is relatively new, but is a tool designed in a similar way and can be really helpful for negotiating this. But more than almost any other area, I think, that we've talked about so far, this is a place where getting an IP lawyer in the room is just extremely helpful, because there's a lot of nuance for how do you precisely define what the intellectual property is, under what conditions do different clauses apply, etc. And good point for Dell. Simplified way, when we're talking about intellectual property here, patents is the easiest way to think about it, but it can be a little more complex in practice. And a lot of tech transfer has its own set of policies. So whether you give away 2% equity or 10% equity, it's a whole complex set of elements. But for today's purpose and set of sessions, what you'll want to be aware of is universities often own the IP. You'll have to negotiate with them for your startup to get a set of rights and value exchanges to be able to use that for your own small business. Question in the chat: if an IP has multiple founders, can each of them have the right to open a different small business? Will you be posting these links? I'm not sure about which links are being referred to in the chat, but to Dell's comment, if they decide not to pursue a patent, they can assign it to you and pursue the patent yourself. Yeah, to phrase that a little differently, university often owns intellectual property. They will often have resources, so they will essentially like invest $10,000, their lawyers' time, etc., to build the patent related to it. And if they do, they often they often will own the equity. If they don't actually think your intellectual property is worth that much, and they don't pursue the patent, and you decide to pony up the $10,000 or write the patent application yourself, you often retain more of that equity. And as far as those links go, I think Slack is probably a good place for some of these more casual, like Zen Business, Clerky, Model IA. That might be a good way to go about sharing out those links.
Well, and also I was going to say too, Arsh, in Slack and the all ITEP 2025 channel, if you go to the tab to the right, it's called Company Handbook because you can't change the name of it. And there's a section at the top that says helpful links. So as we're moving through these and like giving people links, like
Yeah.
we'll try and drop them in there like as we can.
7 minutes on the clock. We'll continue to try and round out the comments. So did come up earlier of conflicts of interest and compliance when it comes to universities. Universities do often have pretty specific requirements. It could be as easy as make sure you send an email to the VP of research just telling them that you're doing something to please fill out the following form. So you probably want to work with tech transfers, often the ones aware a lot of these components because they've been here, done that. But you want to follow those elements of disclosing an invention, doing a compliance review to make sure that you've licensed the IP, making sure they do those 6-month check-ins. And conflicts of interest are often pretty critical. A concrete example that I've seen a bunch of times. So let's say that you have a university professor who wants to stay being a university professor, but they want to start commercializing some intellectual piece of property. Often what they'll do is they'll have the postdoc or some postdoc be the CEO of the company and be the full-time PEI that can do everything. But also they're still a postdoc. And so in a situation like that, you'll definitely want to have some kind of conflict of interest agreement or some way to navigate that budding tension, where now suddenly, aside from postdoc and professor relationship, you now also have the CEO, PI, and co-PI at a university agreement. But an answer to a lot of this is talk to tech transfer when it comes to these components is a really critical audience because they can help you figure out not only like what paperwork do I submit when, but what are the trade-offs? When do I have to reduce my university commitment or transition to an advisor role or transition on a sabbatical or a unpaid leave for 1 year? It really depends on what university you're at, but the tech transfer can often be helpful for those areas. Oh, and one piece of personal experience. So for me, it's kind of the opposite. The TTO is going to drop pursuing the patent if we don't license it, and of course pay them. Basically, they feel it has no value if we don't license it. So let's say we go ahead and drop the patent, and then we continue our small business and develop the technology. Yeah, makes sense. For lots of tech transfer, they operate almost kind of like a investment firm of their efforts. And so a lot of different routes available depending on if they decide to invest in the technology or not, or if someone else decides to commercialize it. 2 other quick components as we round out the hour and a half. So one is just something I think I mentioned during the Q&A at the end of last section. It's really different being a researcher, a faculty member versus the CEO of a research-based startup. Often there comes a point where you might want to transition from one to the other. You were a researcher at a university. Now you're helping commercialize and productize a research-based innovation as a business. That's really exciting. Or you step away. You decide to hire a CEO. You have them grow the business, and at some point they buy you out in your co-founder shares. One thing just to be mindful of is of those differences. And hopefully by the end of this program, you understand what those differences are. And if you're excited about things like setting up HR, talking to lawyers about the difference between LC and a C Corp, and all the sort of differences and nuances involved. And we talked a little bit about partnerships earlier, but wanted to just mention that the stakeholders available as a university-based startup are huge. You can have a talent pipeline through your lab and the students who've graduated out of it over time, but also postdocs and co-founders and interns. A pretty common thing that universities offer are things like, oh, we have a capstone with our business students. They'll just do your market analysis as long as you talk to them once a week for 6 weeks, or industry partnerships. So for some tech transfer offices, they have things like Ignite software, but these huge repositories of decision makers and people they can reach out to do things like license agreements. But some of that whole section is talking to tech transfer can be a little tricky because you're sometimes negotiating with them, but are a great resource. And they're often sort of the front door to realize, oh, my university has resources beyond just the educational. They have all of these areas that can support a small business that I personally develop. And with our final 3 minutes, I'll just say this. Deluge of information, plenty of areas to jump off of. Your mentors will be a good way to go about figuring out what do I do right now? In what order do I start pursuing those? Do I incorporate my business? Do I do customer interviews? Do I start thinking about MVP product design? Your mentor can be a really helpful resource for figuring out what those items are. And at the end of the program is a presentation that I think can help organize a lot of that information. So we reviewed this a little bit in the first session, but there is basically a ad lib style fill in the blank type of deck that you will have access to that you'll present at the very end. And it's in a lot of these areas. What do you do? Broken down into a few key elements. What's the size of that impact? What is the business model? What is your SBIR? That deck will be a way to actually be a forcing function as you answer those questions, and then particularly in partnership with your mentor. It'll hopefully be a concrete way to be like, oh, I actually have to explain how I'm going to make money. Whether or not I have a full grasp of B2C versus B2B versus B2G versus B2B2C, like there's all kinds of options. But talking to your mentor about your specific business, hopefully they'll be able to help articulate precisely what you need and when you need it. And we certainly don't have time to go in that much more detail, but certainly have space further on where we'll be doing that. Quick final notes. A lot of today's session is just applying for an SBIR and SDTR can often focus on the proposal itself, which is really important, but there's also just doing the business part. And hopefully this begins to give you some exposure and build some foundation of what does it take to launch a business. Where next session, we'll be talking about the product. So Chris will be leading that session, understanding your innovation and product market fit, how that specifically applies to health product differentiation, business positioning, and scaling strategies, the difference from building one molecule versus building a million, and all of those related elements. And that takes us to 2 o'clock, a really vibrant, dynamic first session. Super excited for this cohort. Have a couple seconds left for any last comments or questions, but otherwise just want to express appreciation. This was a really phenomenal start to a program.
I'm impressed with you ending on the dot. That is amazing.
Yeah, I rushed a little towards the end, but got there.
You got it done.
I say ending on the dot, one final comment for people. And just you've heard us talk a lot throughout the presentation today about, talk to your tech transfer office, particularly like co-founders and things like that. The one thing I will say, and that is critical for everybody, is get stuff in writing. I cannot tell you how many businesses I have seen totally fall apart and people damn near come to blows on, well, we set this up, we started this up, we didn't do this. It's just an informal agreement. It's a handshake. No, contract is law, particularly as a business. What you have in writing, what is signed, what is notarized is going to be like how things operate. So, when you do things like with partners or friends or, advisors or, anything where it's like, okay, well, this is going to be a business decision. This is going to be a part of the business. Get stuff in writing because that's going to be your, frankly, CYA policy in the future.
Yeah, and the effort to move fast and break things, make sure you're not the thing that's broken. It's not bad advice to end on. But that will call it a wrap. Great seeing you all. I'm excited for a session with Chris next week.